Hi, Ankeny Free Church. For those who don't know me, I'm Hunter Thorpe. When I was an undergraduate, I studied religion and philosophy, and this ultimately led me to go to law school. In each one of these disciplines, philosophy, law, and religion, we focus on finding the truth. As Pontius Pilate said so many years ago, what is truth? Well, today, we are confronted with a culture that is asking the same question, but in such a different manner. I hope to answer, or at least begin to answer this question for us. Today, Christians understand truth in a different way than our culture does. In the past 40 to 50 years, there has been a rapid transition in the way that we understand the self and how this self relates to the world around us. What if the framework for this issue has existed for a long time? What if the framework our culture uses to explain transgenderism or even modern conspiracy theories has been around since long before the founding of our nation even? Well, today we're going to dive into that a little bit. Before I dive in, though, I want to go over a couple things. These are primarily definitions because I want you to understand what things mean when I use them. If I start saying words that are college-level words or, just words that you don't normally hear, I want people to understand it so you don't have to pull out a dictionary while you're listening to this. So to begin, I want to start with the word epistemology. Epistemology focuses on how we know things. It's the study of knowing. And there are varying views that are considered good epistemological frameworks, or at least primary epistemological frameworks in our culture. The first is the relativist emotivist, and that is that truth is psychologized, meaning that truth is internal, not eternal. And empiricism is another one. This is that all knowledge is data-driven, and this can really be seen in scientists where all things have to be broken down into numbers or that which can be repeated through scientific experiment. The last primary epistemological framework we see in our culture is the theistic or Christian view. For purposes of this session, we will be focusing on the relativist emotivist framework because that tends to be the most popular view, especially when talking about morals or guiding principles, alongside with the Christian worldview regarding these things. So here are a few more definitions. The first is the therapeutic self. This is actually where the title of this talk comes to, the triumph of the therapeutic self. It's the idea of whatever is most pleasing to us, whatever makes us happy is the most important. This plays out in how we understand what it means to be human. It helps us, if to be human is to be most real, how are we to determine what is real? Well, under this view, if somebody likes to read fantasy novels, this makes them happy. This is their reality as a therapeutic self. While we know that it doesn't correspond with actual reality, that person has made it their own reality. This is not an attack on the term therapy, nor is this workshop going to trash therapy. Therapy can be important and it's a good thing, especially if you have some mental health issues that you need to address. Another term that's important is the psychological self. This is the self that we perceive ourselves to be when we're asked who we are. This inevitably comes back to the question of what it means to be human. It has implications on the personhood, what personhood is, and what our chief end is as humans. What were we created for, or why are we here? The last term is expressive individualism. This is the belief that others must affirm what we perceive ourselves as, and any attack on this perceived self is considered a transgression or even oppression. This talk will largely be based off a book called The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self by Karl Truman. It's about a 500-page book. I would recommend it to anybody. While it's written by an academic, it's very readable, and he goes over a lot of the stuff I'll go over in a much greater depth. The only difference is I'm going to apply it a little bit differently than he does. He applies it to homosexuality, abortion, and transgenderism. That's how he concludes his book, is applying this historical analysis to those things. Well, the big question today is, how do we understand the self, and where does knowledge come from? Well, I'm going to give you a framework for the relativist emotivist and give you a philosophical background for how we got to where we are today. Following that, I'm going to look at how this works in the modern context and where we can go from here. I think without any application, this type of talk will be rather pointless, or at least just an academic run-through, and I don't want that. I want everything that's talked about here to be something that you can take forward and apply it in some way, shape, or form. So to begin with the history, about 500 years ago, or more, 400 years ago, in the Netherlands, there was a man named Descartes. Descartes was a Frenchman who, he's very famous for his philosophy, his science, and his mathematician work. He wrote a book called The Discourse on Methods of Rightly Conducting One's Reasons and of Seeking Truth in the Sciences. It's more commonly known as the Discourse on the Method because that other title is just ridiculously long and nobody wants to say that every time that they're referencing a book. His primary concern was the ability to know things after the scientific revolution. He found that science unhinged from a proper metaphysical and epistemological framework would ultimately result in atheism. He didn't want this. So to prove an epistemological framework, he used a method called skepticism. This is where you doubt everything so as to remove any preconceived notion or bias that it may bring. So he would start with saying, everything that I perceive, that's reality. Well, should I doubt my perception? Should I doubt things that I take for granted? Well, he goes through this whole process. He breaks it down to the point where he's sitting and he's wondering whether he even exists. But then it comes to his most famous statement, I think, therefore I am. What this statement says is the fact that he has knowledge, that he can perceive himself, is proof that he exists. From here, he begins to build up a basis for everything that exists and points back to the evidence of God's existence. There are two things to note about his philosophy. The first is the potential productionist solipsism. This is the idea that you are a singular mind and that everything else is an illusion. This theory is also called the brain in the vat theory and is actually subscribed to by various famous people, including Elon Musk, the world's richest man. It's also the basis for the popular movie franchise from the early 2000s, The Matrix. In The Matrix, they're plugged into these machines, and aside from that, there's a reality outside of these machines, but when they're in these machines, it's somewhat their reality. It's a complex movie series, but it's very heavily based on Descartes' theory. But the more revolutionary idea and relevant point to our discussion is the turn inward that occurs. Prior to Descartes, there was this Christian basis for knowledge where everything was external. We could see and understand things by looking at the world around us, and things were defined not based on how we perceived them, but on what they were and what they are in the created order. While Descartes would not have understood knowledge as being derived from being personal, his ideas created a basis for doing so. His knowledge had to turn in, or his basis for epistemology required turning inward before you could go externally. It's my belief that this is why we rely on emotions more than external observations of truth. But before we can get to that point, we have to go over some other thinkers who took Descartes' theory and moved him a step forward. The first being Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Jean-Jacques Rousseau is a famous French philosopher. He primarily focused on political and educational philosophy, and he was living in Geneva in the 18th century. Interesting tidbit about him, he is famous primarily for his educational philosophy and how to raise children properly, but he actually didn't raise his own children. He had a difficult time with them. He didn't enjoy being a parent, so he gave that off to somebody else to do. However, in the context of what we're talking about today, he moves us a step forward by moving a step inward. As previously stated, Descartes rejected the idea of knowledge being personal. However, Jean-Jacques Rousseau saw knowledge, particularly as it relates to the self and morals, as aesthetics. He did not believe that all morals were aesthetic, but rather how we get and disseminate them into our culture are. What this means is he didn't believe that all morals came internally, but he believed that the way that we apply them to our culture is external. So he would look at something like religion and say, well, their application of morals from natural law is correct, but the way that they say certain things that are only derived from, say, Holy Scripture or something, that would be improper. But this raises a question of why. Why did his philosophy do this? Well, his philosophy is based on how he understood the nature of humanity. So Historically, Christians have believed that society is a necessary thing, and so did ancient philosophy. There was a large emphasis on the need for community. In the context of Christianity, the church has always had authority because it is the collective wisdom and knowledge of people appointed by God through the Holy Scriptures to make decisions. We rejected the notion of the single leader model, with the exception of Catholicism, because we see the problem in having just a single leader. This can lead to tyranny. This can lead to oppressive frameworks. It can lead to abuse and corruption. We even see this today. We see James MacDonald's scandal with his church. We see that same issue with Ravi Zacharias' ministry, and we see that with the Mars Hill churches in Seattle that were led by Mark Driscoll. All of these churches had the illusion of having people who were working as safeguards to protect from leader abuses, but in reality, the leader was a singular model. He made the final decision, and the elders or people that were on the board of directors were essentially there to affirm what they said. This became apparent when these ministries suffered issues involving leadership. The church has instead historically been Episcopal, elder-led, or congregational, all of these meaning that multiple people were making decisions. This is due to the belief that individuals by nature are corrupt, and too much power in the hand of one is harmful. In the philosophical world, we have people like Aristotle who said that man is by nature political, meaning that humans need other individuals in order to function correctly. For society to work, we need other people. It's impossible to have a society where there's only one person and they're living by themselves. No man is a mountain, and that's just apparent, and it becomes more readily apparent the more you think about what you have on you. For instance, I have a cell phone in my pocket right here. This thing would not be possible but for society coming together. We have parts from all around the world that had to come together. Society is needed for basic things that we take for granted in society now. We need multiple people to get things that we need just to function. Well, this philosophy of Aristotle and the ideas the church should be the collective working together, these were built on for nearly 2,000 years, and they played out in the medieval times through guild organizations and bodies where commoners were given some power. However, Jean-Jacques Rousseau rejected the idea that society actually was good. He believed that society corrupts. He believes that humans by nature are good, that they started as a blank slate, but ultimately it's through education and society that corrupts them. He believed that human emotions are primarily good with our nature, and when we're taught to suppress certain emotions by society, this was a corrupting of the authentic self, and a person becomes inauthentic, and this inauthenticity is the ultimate source of unhappiness. Meaning, conversely, that if you were to be happy, you need to be authentic and living out whatever you feel is right. Well, there's a couple things here. First, it's self-evidently wrong, because if you believe that society is corrupt but humans are good, how did society become corrupt? How does the collective become wrong if the individual is good? Also, the second issue from a Christian perspective is that it rejects the idea of original sin, that humans are corrupt by nature due to the fall of Adam. Well, as a result of Jean-Jacques Rousseau's philosophy, he believed that morals needed to be restructured around reason rather than societal expectations. He taught that morals are often disseminations of aesthetic preferences of a society, and he argued that instead we should focus on that which makes us more authentic individuals, or that which makes us more happy. In the context of the question of the self, Rousseau believes that humans were outpouring of their corrupt society, and to be what one felt prior to culture instilled values was to be the authentic self. In doing so, he rejects cultural institutions such as the church and organized religion altogether. But does anybody see a problem with the implications of his philosophy? For one, this rejects reason altogether and any restraint on why a person, or at least This rejects reason or any restraints on a person, or at least rejects the logical basis for such a restraint or for reason. It took away the understanding of natural law, which is the basis of American law. Natural law says that there are certain principles that can be derived from nature, and these rules are things that should be applied to all societies everywhere. It also takes away direct revelation, or that which we find in knowledge as the best source of truth. Secondly, in the first time in history, we see the basis for morality lose its foundation completely. While Rousseau said it's based upon reason, his reason had some large assumptions that probably assumed too much. First off, it assumed a homogeneous people. It assumed that, everybody would be thinking like him, like a 18th century Frenchman living in Geneva. It requires a similar culture and a similar values for this to work. Even though he says these things are aesthetic, he ultimately requires some of them for the basis of his foundation. It also assumes that people can act and think dependently of cultural inhibitors. It's saying that I can think besides what I've been taught to believe from the beginning of my life. And while that is possible, it's not something that just you can do one day without actually having to process all this. It's impossible to take off all your cultural inhibitors immediately and recognize that's what they are. Additionally, without some transcendent starting point or foundation, these ideas would naturally lead to the relativization of morals and the notions of the self. What I mean is that there would be no basis for society to say what is good or bad. The individual ultimately becomes sovereign, and sovereign even above truth. What the individual feels becomes the ultimate reality. If to be authentic, then, is to be who you are by nature, anything contrary is either immoral at best or oppressive at worst. Well, this leads us to our next philosopher, Frederick Nietzsche. This is probably one of the more well-known philosophers of the last couple hundred years. He was popularized recently in a Christian movie, God's Not Dead, because they use his quote, although they misattribute it, as you're going to see here soon, or they at least take it out of context. But one weird shift we see culturally following Rousseau is a detachment of meaning existing from external forces. We see that ethics and morality were deemed to be preferences. Despite this, Western culture largely assumed Christian ethics, even with the foundation for Christian ethics eroding. Monogamy continued to be practiced, there was a rejection of infanticide, and people still continued to care for the poor, as Christians had done for nearly 2,000 years. One philosopher came along and challenged this. Frederick Nietzsche was born into a post-Enlightenment Germany. Within culture, he observed a few things. First, he observed that Germans had culturally rejected Christianity. The average person would either reject the faith in part or would be nominally Christian or have some cultural faith. They would be Lutheran because to be German is to be Lutheran. However, they would reject the resurrection, they would reject the virgin birth, they would reject these doctrines that historically have been central to being Christian. Well, Frederick Nietzsche, as I previously said, was famous for saying, God's dead. Well, does anybody know where this comes from? It comes from the story of the madman. In this city, there's this crazed man who goes into the middle of a city square while it's crowded, and he starts shouting, God is dead, and we have killed him, God is dead. This madman goes to taunt these citizens, and he tells them that you killed God, you killed God. What he's trying to say here ultimately doesn't have to do with the madman himself, but it's the idea behind it. Nietzsche believed that the Enlightenment had ultimately untied the basis of morality from faith in God. With the publication of Origin of Species in 1859, Nietzsche saw the culture had largely rejected Christianity, but was still holding on to the faith despite it being unnecessary. The story of the madman is the story of a man calling on the citizens to be intellectually honest with themselves. If you're going to reject Christianity, if you're going to reject the miracles, if you're going to reject the deity of Christ, you must reject the ethics and morality that naturally flow from such a belief. While Nietzsche has been called a nihilist, that's rather inaccurate. Instead, he rejected Christianity as a basis for morality because if you're going to reject the actual intellectual, theological, and epistemological framework for Christianity, you need to reject the morality and ethics that flow from it. So for Nietzsche, morality meant a couple things. It meant that you need to fulfill people's desires, you need to give the strongest what is due to them, and you need to reject anything that's transcendent. Anything that comes from a transcendent argument is improper. If anyone has studied Darwin's theory of evolution, Nietzsche's philosophy is heavily aligned with it on morals and the radical implications of it. But for the purpose of our study, Nietzsche furthers the timeline because Nietzsche took some of Rousseau's values to their logical conclusions. If values are only aesthetic, they largely would be based upon the desires of individuals, and again, the values of those who could assert their will upon the other, predominantly the strong in society. Further, with the advent of Darwin's theory, Nietzsche's philosophy could be explained in scientific terms. This is the natural selection. This is the strongest living out their ability to be strong. This is the weak perishing as they're supposed to under the theory of natural selection. Well, the strong asserting their wills was the natural order of things under his view. With these two premises in mind, we can see one other area in which the modern self has become psychologized. You see that it's about asserting yourself. It's asserting what you want, your will. That is ultimately the basis for morality. If you think of where we were prior to Nietzsche, prior to Rousseau, prior to Descartes, this is a large departure from there. We're rejecting values as being something external as part of a created order to the point where what feels good and what makes me feel right, my will, is ultimately the ultimate source of truth. Well, there are two remaining thinkers that I want to touch on just briefly to help us understand the therapeutic self, or how we have come to stress feeling good as the basis for truth, and that being more important than that which corresponds with reality. The first is better known and probably the most divisive of the thinkers that I'm going to talk about today, and that's Karl Marx. Karl Marx was a German philosopher and political theorist, primarily known for communism as his radical theory. That's his biggest theory that he came up with. And when it comes to the question of the therapeutic, we previously discussed Descartes making the search for knowledge making it internal. Well, Marx made this about material reality. He broke down the world into two non-neat categories that can kind of be fluctuating depending on the way you want to talk about it. The first is oppressor and oppressed. He saw religion as essentially a thing to dull the pain of an otherwise meaningless existence of working. He saw the working class as whittling their lives away, and the ruling class is creating this to make the working class feel better. Marx saw objective claims about truth and morality as a ruling class value and something to be rejected. He believed that these things existed to once again force the working class into working and further oppressing them. He believed that this oppression would cease after a violent revolution, and as we've seen historically, his values have never played out well. We have the Soviet Union, we have China, we have North Korea. We've seen so many nations try communism, and ultimately, none of them are better off. They have just as much oppression, they have just as many issues with the working class. Well, for purposes of this workshop, Marx is important because his ideas ultimately have become to be understood outside the realm of economics. There's a school that was in Germany, the Frankfurt School, that existed prior to World War II, that they took his idea of oppressor and oppressed and they applied it to other areas. They applied it to race, they applied it to gender, they applied it to just about any area in life. This has become known as critical theory. Recently, we've heard a lot about critical race theory, but I'm not going to touch on any of these specific theories. Just know that this came out of the Frankfurt School that dealt with communism. Well, the next philosopher, or person that I want to talk about, because he's much less a philosopher than he is a scientist, although it kind of gets mixed up with him because he has some weird views, is Sigmund Freud. Freud was an Austrian psychologist, and he's the founder of psychoanalysis, which is the modern basis for therapy. It's the talking back and forth with your therapist. It's something that I'm sure some of you have done before, and it's something that can be very good. He's most famous for making every aspect of human development about sex, though. That's one of the biggest things that he's known for. This view has largely been discredited. However, he was able to take the idea of happiness and make it into a driving force for humans and put it into scientific terms. He talked about sex being something that makes us happy, and it should ultimately be an ultimate good, although sometimes it needs to be inhibited for greater happiness. In Freud's view, you need to go after happiness in whatever is important. And there's analysis from Carl Truman in his book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, that helps with this. He said that Freud has in fact provided the West with a very compelling myth. The idea that sex and sexual fulfillment is what it means to be a fully human. Without getting into much detail, he was able to explain sex in a way that made it so it was all in scientific terms, how fulfillment and being fully human is doing that which makes you happy. In that case, it would have been sex. But for the point of this talk, Freud can be described as giving scientific weight to the belief that the self we understand ourselves to be, our psychological self, is truly what it means to be human. Well, later we see this combination of Marx and Freud, where we see that objective reality is oppressive, Marx, and our happiness is the ultimate good, Freud. With the Frankfurt School combining these two, we see the denial of another's happiness under Marxist theory becomes an act of oppression. So when we see the combining of Marx and Freud, we see that objective reality is oppressive, Marx, and our happiness is the ultimate good, Freud. With the Frankfurt School, we see the denial of another person's happiness under Marxist theory becoming an act of oppression. This is why we have advocates for certain groups referring to thoughts and ideas as oppressive. These ideas, they hurt somebody's feelings or they hurt their identity, and in doing so, it's an attack on that identity. It's an act of oppression. This leads to the idea that our thoughts, words, and just generally the way we act towards people can ultimately be a harm without having a physical harm towards somebody. And this is something we're seeing largely played out in our culture recently. I'm sure some of you guys have heard somebody say, you're being oppressive with the way that you're talking. You're talking like an oppressor. Well, that's coming from this idea of combining Marx and Freud. The combination of Marx and Freud ultimately, though, made everything political. And I think that Carl Truman again states this problem clearly. It's for the one for whom everything is political, there is no context for discussing such things as pre- or non-political matters. What this means is, when something becomes an act of oppression to somebody, there's no way of talking in a framework outside of this to that person. They're going to view it as this way, and to try and separate that from the actual intellectual idea, the intellectual merits from whether it's oppressive or not, or whether it's true or not, it becomes a hard question. It's splitting hairs to that person in a way that's just not appropriate. Well, you guys may be thinking, this is great, but how did a bunch of philosophers that most people have never heard of come to profoundly impact the world? Well, I'm going to give you a couple ideas of how these ideas came to be understood largely by the culture. And the first idea is through the dissemination of arts and literature. So Nietzsche's ideas have been discussed in popular novels, especially at the dawn of the 19th century. The brothers Karamazov, Idiot, these two books by Fyodor Dostoevsky, they both focus on a lot of the ideas that Nietzsche writes about, the idea of God being dead, and if God is dead, what does that mean? In his book, The Brothers Karamazov, it leads one of the brothers to murder somebody. If God is dead, then ultimately there's no consequence for my actions. That's the same idea in one of his other books called Crime and Punishment. It's a theme that gets revisited and revisited. Additionally, we see surrealist arts talking about the discussion of dreams as an inspiration for art, and this being a source for solving real problems in the actual world. There's a leading historian on surrealist art who said that the purpose of surrealist art is, in fact, to have an impact on the political world. It was actually meant to be a revolutionary thing. Salvador Dali, he created these things, these very weird pictures that look like they are dreams, these paintings that are just make no sense. They were supposed to be a critique of culture. While everybody wouldn't look at a picture and understand that was part of the intent behind it. Additionally, we see something called the Pornification of Culture, and this is something that largely happened post-World War II. We see Hustler and Playboy, TV-14 shows, all these things having sex and that which makes me feel good becoming the ultimate purview of our culture. We see people saying that, well, if sex makes me feel good, if seeing naked women makes me feel good, then why shouldn't I be able to go to the gas station and buy a magazine where that's it? And something that would have been unthinkable 100 years ago is pretty commonplace now. You can go to a store and they will have a Playboy magazine. They will have a Hustler magazine, and it's going to have naked people in it. Well, additionally, we see this in TV-14 shows. I know that a lot of people love the TV show Friends. In fact, it was probably the most popular TV show to come out in the past 30 years. But it has 236 episodes, and there are 6 friends in this show for anybody who hasn't seen it. Between these 6 friends, they have 86 total sexual partners in all 236 episodes. This is an average of 2.75 episodes between every new sex partner being introduced. You see, there's this idea of if it makes me feel good, that should be a part of what it is. And we see that kind of play out in Friends. And I'll get back to that a little bit more. And I'm not trying to rag on Friends. It's just I think it's a good indicator of our culture. Freud and Marx's ideas have also been heavily involved in pop culture. There's a Billboard topping song from 1996 from Mizzou grad. Pastor Todd and Pastor Kevin both went to Mizzou, that said, "If it makes you happy, it can't be that bad. If it makes you happy, then why the hell are you so sad?" That song is talking about if it makes you happy, that's good. That should be your reality. And back to Friends, it's a show about friends who are ultimately trying to discover who they are. And if something doesn't make them happy, if their job doesn't make them happy, if their relationship doesn't make them happy, if their relationship with their family doesn't make them happy, I'm going to cut these things off. I'm not going to talk to my dad because X, Y, and Z. It's just, that's a part of what the show is. It's not a question of what is true in the show. It's a question of what makes them feel good. There's also the idea that this has been disseminated in our legal system as well. The United States Supreme Court ruled in the controversial case Roe versus Wade that at the heart of liberty is the right to define one's own concept of existence, of meaning, of the universe, and the mystery of human life. In this case, they are essentially saying that which makes you feel good, we're allowed to define that. We're allowed to define what it means to exist, what meaning is. We're allowed to define the universe, and it's based on what I feel inside. Well, the reasoning in Planned Parenthood versus Casey, which is actually the more important abortion case when you're looking at Supreme Court precedent, states that abortion is needed to keep women happy, therefore we ought to keep it. It's this idea that if it makes us feel good, it's part of our society. When I was delivering this talk in person, I had somebody ask me if there's other areas that this has played out in our culture, other ways that's been disseminated. And somebody in the audience offered up their own experience, and that's with corporate America. And there's a lot to say about corporate America. I added something about Nike. I don't know if many of you are aware, but in the mid-2010s, probably around 2015, there was a bill that was going to make it so transgender persons had to use the bathroom with the sex that they were born as. It wouldn't allow you to go to the bathroom that you were identifying as. Well, this bill passed. Most people wanted it in the state of Indiana. Well, Nike came in and said, if you don't appeal this law, we are going to remove all our business from you. And Google did the same thing. And ultimately, you have these big companies withdrawing from places that they disagree with somebody's policy on something because it's making people unhappy. You're seeing corporate America setting a value on their agenda. They're saying, this is what we want, so we're going to make it so that everybody wants these things. They're disseminating these values in our culture. This has become known as woke capitalism, and I don't think it's going to be going away anytime soon. I think we're going to see more and more a press in corporate America to have whatever that corporation's values are, whatever they're trying to get done, to be put into either law, or they're going to refuse to do business with people who don't make laws that favor whatever they see as reality and see as truth. With all of this in mind, I'm going to do a quick recap. Philosophy has shifted from the external to the internal as a source of knowledge. We started with a Christian foundation, or even an ancient Greek foundation that saw knowledge as an external thing by looking at the outside world to come to understand it. Well, with Descartes onward, there was a philosophical shift inward. Because of this, values have become largely aesthetic under Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Nietzsche. With Darwin and Freud, there was a scientific basis for taking Rousseau and Nietzsche's ideas. Freud and Marx's theories have been combined together in a manner that someone can say that an attack on the psychological self, or the self we perceive ourselves to be, is an act of oppression. This leaves us with a few questions, and where do we go from here? Where can we see this now? And I think the idea that therapeutic self plays out in multiple areas. The transgender movement has stressed that feelings and the psychological self should be the basis to override a biological reality. We see it play out in Peter Singer. Peter Singer is someone who advocates for post-birth abortion, and if that sounds weird, what it literally means is killing an infant after their mother has given birth. He believes that children cannot be considered truly human until they are able to have rational thoughts, and that if happiness is ultimate, parents should be allowed to murder their kids. Their happiness is more important than the life of the child that has been born. It's less immoral to kill a child that cannot comprehend its own existence than it is to force an adult to take care of that human for 18 years. Well, since I gave this this talk, I heard an article by one of the chief makers of the Affordable Care Act. He said that we should not provide life-saving medical care to anybody who's over the age of 75 because those people don't provide value and happiness. They don't provide anything that's meaningful to society, and they're just a drain on society. That doesn't mean that we should kill them, he said. He said it just means that we shouldn't try to prevent them from dying. And he said when he's 75, he's not going to take any medical care anymore. I think that's easy to say when you're 50 years old and in decent health. We'll see how that plays out in a couple of years when he reaches that age, but that's neither here nor there. I don't want to focus on these larger issues, though, because I don't feel like these are problems for us as Christians. These aren't the issues that we're really arguing with. Instead, I want to focus on some areas that we can actually see this practically. One is with job discontentment. So many of us are defined by our jobs. I'm an attorney. A lot of attorney friends of mine, they are working 80, 90 hours a week because being an attorney is all that they are. They have large job discontentment. Their identity is 100% in being an attorney. But if they don't like this, what they're going to do is they're going to quit their job and go do something else because they're getting their ultimate source of meaning from their job. If life is about what makes you feel good and your job doesn't make you feel good, of course you should go quit it right away. But maybe there's more to what our jobs are. Maybe there's more meaning than just getting our meaning from our job. Additionally, it impacts the way we view politics. If politics is about what makes us happy or what we believe to be true, what we feel to be true rather than what is true, we can embrace some pretty radical and pretty terrible things. I think we've seen that play out in conspiracy theories in the past year. I think we've seen it play out in the way that we talk about different issues, we come to say, well, this is how I feel about the issue. This is how I believe we should resolve this, but it's not based in truth, but it's based on my feelings on how we should handle it. In reality, we should be looking at what's the best way to resolve something based on data, what's the best way to resolve something based on what the outcome is going to be, not on how I feel about it. Lastly, I think this comes to impact us in the way that we view conspiracy theories. We see conspiracy theories have been pretty popularized in the last couple of years. We have theories that are saying that people own a literal Death Star that's hidden behind the moon. I mean, that's a pretty crazy theory. But some people feel that that's true, and because of that, they're making large public statements and they want public policy enacted based on the way that they feel. It doesn't correspond with reality, however. And I don't want to act like I have all the answers. I don't. This isn't an issue that we can just legislate away or we can talk about and it's going to go away tomorrow. It's going to be here for a while. So what? Well, here's some applications, so hopefully this talk isn't just an academic question for us. And the first is that I think we need to question our assumptions. We need to talk, we like to think that our ideas are pure. We like to think that we are the gatekeeper of truth and we don't let any false ideas come into the way that we view things. But is that real? Is that really what's going on? All of us take in culture sometimes without understanding how it impacts us. For instance, my in-laws and my wife and I were watching the TV show Schitt's Creek recently. That show's a pretty negative show. It's just very degrading humor. It's talking about this family who they're going through all this tragic stuff, and the humor's all based on the tragic stuff going in their life. After we watched that show, my wife turns to me and says, "We can't watch this again. Like, it's so negative, and I feel so terrible after watching it." Looking at this show, it's making her feel a particular way. Take this TV show Friends, for instance. Does what we watch make us justify what feels good rather than what God finds abhorrent? Or are we looking at thinking that which is good is ultimately something that God deems inappropriate? I think we can see that play out pretty well in that show just from the example I gave earlier. Or take meme culture, for instance. I'm a millennial, and it's even worse with Gen Z, I'm sure, but we're really into memes. We like these pictures that have a quick, snappy phrase, but honestly, it's not reality. You see this quick punchline at something, and it doesn't have to correspond with reality. It's just like, oh, that's how I feel about that too. I'm going to give that a like. I'm going to give that a love. But does it correspond with reality? Is it something that we're trying to say, this is based in truth, or this is based on how I feel? What are we taking in, and how do we deal with that? We also need to look at to what extent our own identities need to be validated by others. As I previously said, many of us are defined by our jobs. But do we need to be defined by our job? Do I need to be defined by the fact that I'm an attorney? Do you need to be defined by the fact that you're a banker? Or should our identities be in something that is more foundational? Our identities ultimately should be in Christ. Our identities should not be in something that's fading, something that can change. If we're trying to find our identity in our job, ultimately it's going to fail us, and we're ultimately that's going to hurt us. We're going to see this God fail us if we do that. Are we trying to define ourselves as being woke or vehemently not woke? These are unforgiving gods. These are things that are ultimately going to fail you someday. Instead, put your foundation and your trust in Jesus. The next thing we need to do is speak truth. And I know that can be costly and hard. Right now we live in a culture that likes to cancel people. The right likes to cancel those who dare to dissent on issues of race because it makes them uncomfortable, or it doesn't fit this therapeutic view of themselves. The left cancels those who are wrong on LGBT issues, but we have seen conservative Christians accuse many of those, but as I said, it's something that it's not just a left or right issue. It's Christians who are conservative. they've canceled people as well. If you are familiar with Mark Dever, Tim Keller, they've lost speaking engagements because people say that they are Marxist because they believe we need to have a candid talk about race. I mean, I don't know if we need that candid talk about race. Maybe we do, but that doesn't make somebody a Marxist because they believe that thing. We need to look beyond what we feel before we accuse people of things. We need to speak truth when it comes to these things. We can't just set up a straw man to knock it down. We need to truthfully engage our interlocutors or people that we debate with to come to a better understanding. We must be willing to speak the truth, but we also need to be willing to suffer for what we say. As Christians, we believe there's an objective truth and that thus truth exists outside of our feelings. This doesn't mean that we should become a cultural martyr or a culture warrior where we have to fight and die on every hill. There's probably hills that are worth dying on, but we don't have to make every cultural issue that. We don't need to, when little Nas comes out with Satan shoes, we don't need to talk about how this is the worst thing in the world. There's probably worse things going on than some rapper trying to get some publicity by making a ridiculous pair of shoes that are really ugly. We need to be able to take a stand, though. We need to be able to take a stand when it's going to cost us. If you look at John the Baptist, Elijah, Moses, we have many great examples of Scripture of people who make stands that will either end in them being exiled, in the case of Moses and Elijah, or ultimately lose their life. Well, I'm not saying we have to go out and become martyrs, as I previously said. We need to realize that truth may cost us a lot. We are not expressive individualists. We don't believe that just because somebody disagrees with the way that we view things, that we need to get rid of that person or that's an act of oppression against us. We believe there's somebody to engage and discuss with, and that's what we need to do. Additionally, we need to avoid supporting that which has little evidence to support it. Conspiracy theories, by definition, are that which don't have enough evidence to make a credible case. Christians have historically said that the ninth commandment, the thou shalt not bear false witness, has duties required with it. Here's what the Westminster Longer Catechism, answer 144, has to say about that. The duties required of the ninth commandment are preserving and promoting of truth between man and the good name of our neighbor, as well as our own, appearing and standing for the truth, and from the heart sincerely, freely, clearly, and fully speaking the truth, and only the truth in matters of judgment and justice, and in all things whatsoever, a charitable esteem of our neighbors, loving, desiring, and rejoicing in their good name, sorrowing for and covering their infirmities, freely acknowledging our gifts and grace, defending their innocency, a ready receiving of good report, and an unwillingness to admit an evil report concerning them, discouraging talebearers, flatterers, slanderers, love and care of our own good name, and defending it when need requires, keeping lawful promises, studying and practicing of whatever things are true, honest, lovely, and of good report. Ultimately, this is saying that we need to care about the truth. We need to fight for the truth. Even if it's going against somebody we don't like, we need to be truthful. We need to be honest. What we feel doesn't matter. What is true does matter. And lastly, we need to speak in love. Todd had a couple good messages about this recently, so I don't think I need to dive into it. But the book of Galatians talks about being loving. The book of Ephesians talks about it too. In fact, Paul says in Ephesians 4:15, rather speaking in truth and love, we are to grow up in every way into him who is our head, into Christ. Like I said, I feel like I don't need to touch on this point much. Todd touched on it previously, but if you want to know more about how to speak in love, I recommend the book Gentle and Lowly by Dane Ortlund. It's a fantastic book. It talks about Christ and how he loves those who are sinners, particularly his own, but it talks about a gentle approach. But we also see this in Scripture. You don't need to read that book to understand that. We see Jesus approaching the woman at the well. He knows her sins. He knows what she's done wrong, and he's willing to confront her about that. He's willing to say, you've done this, this, and this. But it doesn't stop him from loving her. In fact, he ultimately leads her to salvation that day. We see examples of this outside of Scripture, though. If any of you are familiar with R.C. Sproul, he is a Presbyterian minister who has a large ministry called Ligonier Ministry. Well, he happens to be good friends with the shocking rock artist Alice Cooper. Alice Cooper was known to do beheadings on his stage, fake beheadings, and all these crazy things, but R.C. Sproul and him were good friends, and in fact, Alice Cooper is an evangelical Christian. You might not get that from the way that he acted on stage when he was younger, but yeah, there's this friendship between people who you look at what they do, what they value, and you wouldn't see friendship, but they're able to speak love to one another. Outside the context of Christians, if any of you are familiar with Justice Scalia and Justice Ginsburg, these are two people that had opposite views on almost every single issue you could have on the political spectrum. However, they were really good friends, and in fact, if you ever want to see a touching eulogy of somebody, look up what Justice Ginsburg had to say when Justice Scalia died. She said that she lost a friend and somebody that made her intellectually more honest. It's somebody who challenged her in everything that she did, but in doing so, it made her better at what she does. We need to be able to do that. We need to be able to speak truth and love to those around us. We need to be able to speak in a way that it makes people question their assumptions, but we also need to do it in a way that we aren't going after them. We aren't being mean. We aren't being cruel. We've seen too much of that recently. It's easy to be cruel. Speaking in love is hard, but I encourage us all to do that. If we're all truth and no love, we will be condemning people. That's easy. If we're all love but no truth, we're going to allow that which God finds abhorrent to continue in the church. We're going to allow our culture to continue to do these things, and we're going to slowly fade into existence, into non-existence rather. But if we speak truth and love, we can stand out like the prophets in the Old Testament. We can be those who herald what God reigns in as true. And someday this may lead to revival. Someday it might lead to something else. We may see a shift in our culture someday on these issues. Maybe we won't. Maybe Christ will come before these things happen. But ultimately, we don't get to abdicate where we are and what we're supposed to do as Christians. Ultimately, we have to speak truth and love. We have to be willing to bear the consequences of that. And in doing so, we need to question our own assumptions to see what are we taking for granted? How are the ideas of our culture really getting inside us? I want to thank you guys for listening, and if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. I would love to talk to you more about this. This is different than the format I initially did this in, where I could ask people, or people could ask me questions and we could have a little bit of a dialogue. But if you want to, reach out to Pastor Todd or somebody at the church and they can get you my information, and I'd be more than willing to have a conversation about this. Thanks.